Okay, so this, as most of you will know, is a leaf spring. It's out of quite a big pickup truck, I believe, 3/4 ton pickup. Pretty sure that's what it's out of. Now, I've been wanting a new knife. I've been talking about forging and making a new knife. And I believe that somewhere hidden inside the steel of this leaf spring is my new knife. So why don't you come along with me? Let's go to the forge and see if we can find that knife that's hidden in here. Let's give it a try.
Whoa, baby, that's hot. The knife is in there with the last little bit of coals as they burn out. When that gets down pretty low, I'm going to turn the fan off. I'm going to leave it overnight. And all I want that to do is anneal, normalize. I've beat the tar out of this thing, but that metal is seriously stressed. It's been pounded and twisted and beaten and heated and cooled and heated, and it just needs a rest, basically. So what you do is you let it come up to full forging temperature, and then you just leave it in there. Shut the fan off, let it burn out naturally, and let it cool down naturally. It might take 2 or 3 hours at least, but that just sort of realigns all the grain, for lack of a better word, and redistributes the metal, takes the stress out of all the hammer marks, all the dent marks from the hammer, and just normalizes it back to a decent piece of steel. And that's the state you want to work with it, even after you've finished shaping it with the forge, because it's a whole lot easier to grind the edge and get the profile on it, drill any holes you need, while it's in a soft state, rather than, of course, after you've hardened it. Whew. Makes for a long day for an old man. Time for a shower, and just to sit back and relax. The only way for me to tell when I might meet that critical temperature, just pull these in here for a minute, keep the temperature where it is when ferrous metal, steel, hits that magical temperature, it loses its magnetism. See? Look at that. Ooh, shit, that's hot. Extend that a bit more. Look at that. And yet, it'll pick up that railroad spike. So we've reached the critical temperature. Now what we want to do is normalize it. That's quite different. I'm trying not to get burnt and show you this at the same time. Let's turn the fan off. Normalizing is quite different than actually heat treating. Let's get that out of there. You see that's nice and red. What we want this to do is cool down all on its lonesome at air temperature. Just like that. We're going to let that sit there until it gets down to normal temperature. And then I think I'm going to do it one more time just to be sure. When you take a piece of this spring steel and you pound and beat and heat it and heat it and heat it maybe 10 times to beat it into the shape you want, it's under a lot of stress. It went from being almost a ½ an inch thick to being approximately 3/16 of an inch thick, and it went from a piece that was about 1 inch wide and 8 inches long to a piece that's 2 inches wide and probably pretty close to a foot. So we really want to take those stresses out of there, let that all the grain of the metal actually has grain, let all that grain in the metal sort of redistribute in a normal way so that it's not under a lot of pressure to maintain the shape it's in. So we're going to let that cool, and then we're going to do it again. Okay, that's still pretty hot, but it's probably good enough for what I'm going to do. So we'll get her back in there and give it its second heat, sometimes 2 or 3, just to be sure. Final soak, heat soak to relax this thing. We're going to heat it back up till it's non-magnetic again. Now when you're quenching it, you want to take it even a little hotter than that. Non-magnetic is about 1425 degrees Fahrenheit. When I actually go to quench this, I'm probably going to take it up a little over 1500, but this will definitely relax it a little bit. So let's back a bit here, and here she comes. So first we quench it, and then once we've got it super hard, then we get it into an oven and we temper it back down to a hard Rockwell, but something that's not so brittle. So I'm going to end up putting this in a toaster oven, which I bought for a couple of dollars at one of the secondhand stores, to keep in the garage just for exactly this type of thing, and then I don't have to use the house oven. Okay, we're definitely at non-magnetic. So we're going to let that sit for maybe a minute or 2. I've been checking it periodically, so it hasn't been non-magnetic for long. We're just going to give that a minute or 2 to go from 1425 degrees or whatever it is now. Now this particular steel wants to be quenched at about 1500 to 1525. Different steels like different temperatures, and there is a chart on the internet, I will put a link to that, where you can look up different steels and get the heating rates and the quenching rates, the forging rates, and the R value, like the Rockwell value when you're finished. So if you heat this up to a certain temperature, you quench it, and you temper it at a certain temperature, you can pretty closely estimate what your Rockwell will be, the hardness of the steel, very accurately. So I'm going to move the camera a little bit for this quench, and by the time I get that real quick, we'll be ready to do this. What I have is fryer oil, or in America they'd call it grease, fryer grease, that I get from a friend of mine who owns the local chicken shop. I get barrels and barrels of this, or buckets of this stuff for baiting for bears, but it also makes a dandy quench, and it smells good. What you also want to do is preheat the oil. The oil seems to quench better when it's at about 130 degrees, and the simplest way to do that is you just put some hot metal in, or put some metal in the forge, get it real hot, and then before you're ready to go, just dump it in there, give it a moment to bring things up to temperature. Okay, that did catch fire. I didn't want it to flare up too much, so I just dropped it right in there. The vice grips weren't quite adjusted properly, and we'll get it out, clean it up here in a moment. We'll see what we got. This is still warm to the touch. So I've preheated this. You want to get this in the tempering oven fairly quickly after you finish quenching it. You don't really want to wait till tomorrow kind of thing. You kind of want to get it in there pretty quick. Now I want to temper that at 400 degrees, and I want to do it for probably an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then I'm going to do it for another hour and a half to 2 hours. This particular steel, this spring steel, which is almost certainly 5160 spring steel, wants to get forged at about 16 to 1800 degrees. It wants to get heat treated at about 1525 degrees when you quench it, and then it wants to get tempered at between 375 and 400 basically. So I've got this set at 400. Those temperatures for this particular steel will give it its maximum strength, maximum durability, and still make it you know, a good sharpening steel. Okay, so because the handle is pitted and so on from the hammering, and I don't want to grind it too flat, because the whole idea of doing this was to keep the patina of an old hammer tool. If I did all that work on the forge and then turned around and ground it flat, I might as well have not bothered. I might as well have just made the thing out of a piece of flat stock that I could buy. And then I'd have a known steel. But this is the whole idea, is to have this thing old. Sandblasting cabinet here, and what this will allow me to do, of course, is to get down in those little grooves, and I've taped off the blades. Brass here, got 2 or 3 of them, and they've got big gouges in there. I don't know if you can see that. And the metal shop, I'm too close maybe for even focusing, the metal shop gave them to me. They were using for some kind of a shim or something when they were working their lathe, and eventually they'd get all grooved out like that and they were no good. They'd throw them away and get, you know, make a couple more out of their stock. So these 3 or 4 of them they gave me were in the throwaway pile, and they just said, sure, take them. So I'm going to take a hacksaw and I'm going to cut this up, see if I can make a couple of bolsters or something out of them. We'll see. Well, so here we are. The journey has finally ended. It wasn't without its rocky spots, rough times. I actually had to make 2 of these to get this one. But this is it. I think perhaps I'm going to call it the Bug, the B-U-G. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is in a few minutes. It's not what you think. So far, I gotta say, it feels awesome. Rather than having a straighter blade across here, and putting some jimping in there or something, the little lines to give you thumb traction, I decided to go with, you know, with a shape like this where my thumb just sits right down in there. And I know a lot of people will put a choil, the big hoop, like that sharp, the big hoop down here, and you lose a lot of blade space that way. You know, you can lose an inch of blade. And, oh, look at it. And so I thought, well, you know, why would you want to choke up on a knife? Just make a smaller knife if that's the way you feel about it. But by putting my thumb forward like this, and I put the brass pieces on here so that it triples the width of the blade. And that gives me a real good rest for my thumb. And that's a great way, you know, I'm not going to do that. I have a real good control up close if I want to just shave off little, like feather sticks or something, which I don't actually ever do, but you can do it. As you can see, it's not hard to do. I'm going to move the camera in here closer, but also, if you're working out at the tip, you know, you have a lot of control. Just so anybody who says that you can't carve or do notches or whatever you want to do with a larger knife, you got to learn to use your knife. It's not the knife really that makes the job work, it's the person holding it. And you know, any knife would do the job. It's just in my nature to want to make these things. I like doing it as much as I like having it. But here, let me bring the camera in a bit closer and I'll show you some of the features and why I did what I did. Come on. Oh dear. You wouldn't believe how long it takes to get cameras set up in this kind of a deal. Okay, so some of the features that I wanted. First off, I have really, really big hands. My hands take at least 2x gloves, so I have big hands. So I wanted something. One of the problems I always run into with a knife that doesn't have a step up like this, your hands are down at the same level as the blade. And a lot of people, in fact, this seems to be that the style is to have the handle down. So if I'm working on cutting something, my knuckles are dragging into whatever I'm butchering. They're dragging on the meat before the blade ever gets there. And that just is a nuisance. And it doesn't matter whether you're butchering meat or doing any other kind of work. I don't want my hands down into the work surface when I'm working. So by stepping the blade up on an angle like this, now my hands are at least clear of the bottom of the blade, or at least, well, I got big hands like I said, so at least they're closer to being right. So if I'm standing above something and I'm working like this, then I have a better chance of not dragging my knuckles through it. The second thing is, when you're working with a knife, and I know when you're at home, you know, you're cutting up a roast or something like that, normally a knife would have a straight bottom, completely straight across the bottom, and then just the curve up at the very tip. And you know, we always find ourselves using the tip. We don't very rarely ever, you know, cut into a roast like this. We usually cut with the tip because that curved portion gives you the better cut. It's sharper and you have, you know, you can just get that nice slicing action. So by having the entire blade curved, the slicing action is everywhere. I can slice and pull and keep slicing and pulling, and I can slice through an awful long way without actually having to hit a spot in the blade anywhere where I'm not getting a good cutting surface. So as far as the bug name goes, I'll tell you what, why that happened. This knife was sort of an idea of three actually, different knives that are pretty much out of history, really. You know, if you want something that works, that is functional tool, go back a couple hundred years and see what they were making then, or even further back. Because they didn't have the time or the inclination to make something frilly. They needed something that they could survive with. One of those is the ulu, which is the completely curved blade that the Inuit, the Eskimos, use. And they've used those things for centuries. And as far as butchering and cleaning their fish and everything they do, those have been an outstanding design that they are continuing to use even to this day. Another outstanding design that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years is the straight butcher knife that comes along, has the little bump on the top and then the big deep belly of the blade. That was designed that way because it was great for butchering. That's what it was for. And the old mountain men back in the 1700s and even in maybe the early 1800s, when they went into the mountains and disappeared for sometimes years at a time, they would have an old butcher knife as their belt knife. There was no sort of fancy belt knives back in those days. They would get a good sturdy butcher knife or have a blacksmith make them one, and they would be off, and that's what they would use. So again, you know, I've got that long blade with the big belly on it for the butchering and for the slicing. The other thing that kind of got this shape of the handle is a knife that's a Canadian knife. I think something just flew by. Is a Canadian design knife. It's probably about 100 years old, and it was made by Groman, a Groman company, the Canadian belt knife.
and it was somewhat similar in shape to this, and that was kind of what gave me the idea to get my hands up out of the mess that I'm working on by sort of arching the blade and the handle up higher rather than the current trend, which seems to be down lower. So those were the three knives that really were the primary design features or styles that I wanted to incorporate in this. And the hard part is to come up with, when you're taking three complete distinct styles and you're trying to blend them together, it's real hard to get something that looks like it's supposed to be that way. So, you know, three distinct styles often end up looking like you just glued a bunch of stuff together and it's kind of hacky looking. So, you know, it took me a while to get the, you know, a nice flow to it. But anyways, the other thing is I wanted this to look like it was made in the 17 or 1800s. So where I hammered the top, well actually I hammered the whole thing, all of it, everywhere from end to end. I hammered the shape in here. I even hammered the bevel onto it, as you've seen already in the video. But I left the hammer marks in here. And you know, I've seen people where they've forged something out and then they've taken a power grinder and they've ground this all smooth. And so you don't really see the fact that it's a forge mark. And I'm thinking to myself, why would you do that? Why not just get a piece of flat steel? Why would you go to all the trouble of getting nice forged patina in there, nice marks that look like it's nice and old, and then turn around and grind them all off? So I really like this. I like the style, I like the shape, I like everything about it. The weight, even the balance, the balance. Got great balance. I would have actually hoped for it to be slightly blade heavier, but this isn't bad. I can certainly live with that. That's not bad at all. So this turned out to be a real nice knife. I hammered it down just by eye until it looked like it was 3/16 of an inch thick, and actually I'm within about 1/10 thou because you know, I did have to take coarse sandpaper and draw file it and so on. But man, that turned out really nice. And then I got the idea of putting the little brass pieces on the side here with a bit of scrap that I had. And so I did that, and partly because it looks nice, but partly because it triples the width almost of this section here where your thumb sits. Now there was nothing wrong with having my thumb sitting on that edge. There was no discomfort for it, but this just makes it super nice. The fit is awesome. And another thing you're doing when you're making these knives, I'm gonna have to see if I can see what I'm doing here. What are we doing? Where are we? Is you want the fit of your joints to be nice and tight. It's kind of bush league if you've got, you know, the angle on the front of the handle of the scale isn't exactly the same as the angle of this piece up here, and then you can't help but get that slight gap in there. The same with this edge here. When you look at the top, am I seeing this? I can't really see where I am here. There we go. I don't know if we're getting this or not, but if you look at this part right here, this side and this side have to be straight across and equal and tight. You know, you don't want gaps or anything that's not going to look like, you don't want one side of your scale 1/8 of an inch higher than the other side or something. Again, it's kind of a bush league sort of a thing. But that gives you a little bit better look of the patina on there. I don't know. I'm getting glare on the screen here when I'm looking at this, so I can't really tell what you're seeing. Another thing that happens when I'm making anything really is that lots of times I start off with an idea and then the project takes over and sort of tells me what it wants. And as this thing started to develop and as it became what it is now, I had to put the ash handle on it. The knife was starting to look nice and old, and the patina of age kind of a look to it, and it will get more of that as I start to use it, and I just couldn't see having a synthetic type handle on it. I just couldn't do it. So I know I told you that I was going to do that with the micarta stuff that we made, so I owe it to you to do another knife with that. The other thing that I haven't finished is this little lanyard hole back here, and it goes right through the full tang, so that's good. But I was going to get a brass tube, these are brass pins, I don't know if you can see that on here, and put it through there and then just contour it and see that, you know, so that if I wanted to put a lanyard on here, then it would look nice. The other alternative is to just cut the metal out in a nice clean circle on both sides so that I have a little round section of the actual center of the knife right there. Now, I haven't quite decided on that one yet. I don't use a lanyard personally, but if I'm around deep water at the edge of a boat where I have to reach out or something, I sure don't want to lose my knife, even in 6 or 8 feet of water. Up here the water's darn cold. So I would put a lanyard on there and put it on my wrist just so that if anything happened and I bumped my hand, especially in cold water, you know, you can lose your grip a bit, then I'd be able to not lose my knife. And the other time is in deep snow. You know, and if this thing falls and it goes point down or either way into deep snow here when it's deep, it's like waist deeper and deeper. You could be digging for days before you dug out the right spot to find your knife. So sometimes I'll put it's not really a lanyard as much as a tail, so that if I'm working and I drop it in the snow, then I've got this bright orange or whatever color it is tail that's maybe 3 feet long sticking out through the snow, and it's a whole lot easier to find than maybe one end of this that's 4 feet or 5 feet down under the ground, you know, and the snow caves in over it. So those were some of the ways that I designed this, some of the reasons why I did it as I did. Now this hole here serves no particular purpose. It's in leaf springs, which is what this came from, as you know. There's a hole in the center of the springs where a pin goes through to keep the springs from shifting when they're in the vehicle. And that's what this hole is that center pin. And the reason I had to make a second knife is because on the first knife, I welded that in, thinking, well, what the heck, I'll just weld it in, and by the time I sand it and grind it and pound it and everything, it'll be fine. Yeah, that was a great idea. Didn't work. The weld went fine, but then apparently, after the fact, I find out that this steel doesn't weld that great. And in addition to that, when I forged it, the heat of the forging just blew the weld out. So I decided to make a second knife, and just leave the hole there. So call it character. I don't know what we'll call it, but it's there anyway. I don't think it's going to cause any harm. It's certainly not going to cause any weakness. That's 3/16 of an inch thick steel by a little over an inch thick through the center here. So this is a tough knife, and I don't have any doubt in my mind, I'm not going to do that this thing is going to take me wherever I need to go and be a real good knife in the process. So as soon as I get a sheath made, I'm going to start carrying it. I haven't carried it yet because of that. Because the knife led me in the direction that it did, I was going to make a fake micarta sheath, but now I can't really do that because the knife has decided it wanted to be old school. So now I've got to come up with a plan for a sheath. In staying in with the theme, on the wood here, I just put linseed oil, so staying with the theme of the whole thing all the way along. So this is it, folks. That's what she looks like. Now I just hope it performs as nicely. Well, I think it looks nice, but anyways, I hope it performs as well. By golly, it's got a good heft to it. I'm gonna have to weigh it. The blade, another neat thing about a big curve on the blade here is the blade from here to here is only a little bit over 6 inches from the butt here for the tip. But by the time you follow the curvature, you've got about 7 inches. I've lost the camera. You've got about 7 inches of cutting surface by the time you follow the curvature, as opposed to having only about a 6-inch blade. So again, a little bit of an advantage there, just a style advantage. So I hope you like it. I want to thank you very much for following along. It's been a long job, and I have one arm now that's about 6 inches longer than the other one from all the hammering. And if you know anybody else who likes this type of thing or would like to see something like this or how it's done, please share it, like it if you did like it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Everybody have a great week. Take it easy out there. Enjoy the great outdoors. We'll see you down the trail.